Welcome once again, everybody, to Business Law at Columbia College. My name is Cassandra Janicki, and I'll be your instructor for this course. Today, what we're going to be talking about are the beginnings of our contracts module. So, today we'll go over chapters 11 and 12. Chapter 11, you'll see as displayed here, is actually different from the PowerPoint that I provided to you hyperlinked on our Canvas page. And that's because I'm not going to go through and spend the time to read the definitions to you guys. All the definitions are listed on that PowerPoint. You should familiarize yourself with them. Your book also does a great job of explaining what all of those things mean. And if you have any questions about those definitions, you can ask us during the lab. But there are a few things that I want to talk to you about out of Chapter 11. So you will see this page over and over and over again. You will see it almost, I'd guarantee, every single class that we are talking about contracts. And that is because it is so important for you to remember what the definition of a contract is and what the elements are of a contract. We are going to spend the next 6 weeks going through the elements of a valid and enforceable contract and all of the kind of side stuff that goes along with contracts and contractual relationships. So, the definition of a contract is a legally binding agreement that imposes a duty between both parties to perform what they agreed to in the contract. If one fails to perform, it gives rise to a remedy for that breach. You get to sue somebody if they breach your contract because they agreed that they would perform and then they didn't. So, how do you, as a party to a contract, make sure that the contract is valid and enforceable? Well, you include the 6 elements of a valid and enforceable contract. So what we're going to talk about today when we talk about Chapter 12 is we're going to talk about the agreement, okay? The agreement must be between 2 competent parties, and we'll talk about what competency means. That competency must be based on the genuine assent of the parties, and that agreement is supported by consideration, made for a lawful objective, and in the form required by law. I don't expect you to know what all of those mean, but we are going to take days upon days to talk about what each of those means. So, start memorizing this page. Now, we get contracts when people make an offer to another person, and that person accepts that offer. So, when is a contract in existence? A contract is in existence at the time of acceptance. At the time of acceptance of an offer, the contract is binding. And so the parties must demonstrate at that moment the intent to be engaged in a binding contract. If there's a preliminary agreement, if you agree on some terms but not all, that's not a contract. And an agreement to enter into future plans or that talks about what your intentions are, that's not a contract. Now you may say to yourself, well, Cassandra, what can we contract about? Well, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we in America love freedom, right? We love freedom. We love freedom in all different aspects of our lives. Well, I'm here to tell you there's freedom in contracts as well. Courts are loath to overturn contracts. Why? Because if you're doing it right and it's between competent people with genuine assent, courts recognize that you entered into a contract and you have to be held responsible for entering into that contract. So, they don't want to undo that. They don't want to undo that unless there's something really egregious and a super good reason to do that. Because at the end of the day, our economy rests on the validity of contracts. And so, you can contract about just about anything, unless it's in violation of the law, but we'll talk about that later. Now, some terms that you should be aware of. Express contracts are ones where there is an express agreement. Sometimes that agreement can be written, it can be oral, there are very few contracts that have to be written in order to be enforceable. Now, we're going to talk about all the rules of contracts, but I'm also going to give you my rules of contracts, right? So, contract rule number 1 from Cassandra Jenneke. If you want to be able to enforce a contract, good Lord, write it down and have everybody sign it who's going to be a party to the contract. Because otherwise you're going to run into a whole heck of a lot of problems down the road that you could avoid by just writing it down. Okay? Now, there can be things called implied contracts. So, for example, if somebody renders you a service under circumstances indicating that payment for them is expected, you, as the other party, if you know of those circumstances and you accepted the benefits of those services, you got to pay. Now, when we talk in our lab, I'm going to ask you guys for examples of an implied contract. So think about what you think an implied contract might be. During this lecture and the day that this lecture is assigned, you'll also be taking your first quiz. And that will be going over the last 3 classes of content. So the first quiz doesn't deal with contracts at all. A special note for you to think about is that if you have an express contract, so it's spoken or it's written, you don't get to then imply a contract, okay? That doesn't happen simply because you did something pursuant to that other contract. You don't just get to have an implied contract there. So you have to be really careful that if you're going to change an express contract or you're going to add to an you're going to add to an express contract, make sure that you're updating that agreement, either written or orally. So a valid contract is one that is binding and enforceable. That's always the goal, right? Is to make sure that you can enforce your contract and bind the other party to performance. Contracts that are voidable are instances where there was an agreement that is otherwise binding or enforceable, but because of something that happened at the time you executed the agreement, there's a lack of capacity, there wasn't genuine assent, then there are circumstances under which a voidable contract can be rejected at the option of one or both parties, okay? And that's different from a contract that is just void. So agreements that contemplate performance of an act that's either a crime or a tort or something that is prohibited by law, the court can't enforce an illegal agreement. And so that contract has no legal effect and is automatically void. It's not an option. It's not at the option of one or both parties. It's just void. Now, some things for you to think about. Option contracts. So if any of you have ever purchased homes or have entered into big contracts in your lives, you may have heard of option contracts. So you may enter into a contract that gives you or the other party a right to enter into a second contract with that same party at a later date. That other party has an absolute right to enter into that later contract so long as they paid for that right to the option, okay? So for example, if you, my car is leased. And so if built into my lease agreement, if I want to purchase that vehicle at the end of my lease, I have that option and I paid for that option by leasing the vehicle in the first place, okay? I have the privilege and the freedom to buy or to not buy at the end of my lease. Similarly, you can also build into contracts the right of first refusal. So there may be a scenario where there are multiple parties interested in some option, but one party can pay for the privilege to be the first person that you have to ask to invoke that option, okay? Now, a concept that we're going to talk about pretty consistently throughout this class when we talk about contracts is the concept of unjust enrichment. So courts, and this is kind of a holdover from that equity or equitability court that we've talked about when we talked about the development of the American justice system. When we talk about equity and when we talk about what's fair, you may run into a scenario where there is a quasi-contract. there is no contract. It's voidable or it's void. But something has happened in furtherance of that void or voidable contract that will put another party at such a significant disadvantage and will so unjustly enrich the other party that a court will look at the scenario and say, oh, you know what? Man, that's just not fair. So in order to prove that there has been unjust enrichment and that you, as the party who has been wronged, is entitled to something as much as you deserve, this quantum merit that's listed last on the PowerPoint, in order to prove that you are entitled to that, you have to show that there was a benefit conferred on the other party, that the other party knew about that benefit, and that it would be unjust for you or for that party to benefit from that action without some sort of payment to you. And so that quantum merit and unjust enrichment can be invoked in a variety of different scenarios, and as we go through contracts, we'll talk about each of those. Now, as I mentioned, Chapter 11 is almost purely definitions, right? There's a ton of information in there that I didn't go over here because it's just going to be me reading to you the definitions, and I don't think that's a good use of your time or mine. So take the time to read through those definitions. If there's one that you don't understand, bring it up in our lab and we will talk about it. Now, Chapter 12 talks about that first element. The first element of a valid and enforceable contract is that there must be an agreement. And an agreement is built up of two stages. One, there was an offer. And then there was acceptance of that offer. So we're going to talk about all of the things about offers, and then we'll talk about all of the things about acceptance. So, in order for an offer to be valid, there are three requirements. One, the offer has to demonstrate contractual intention. The terms of the offer must be definite, and they have to be communicated to the offeree or the person that you want to accept the offer. So, contractual intention. So, I don't know about you guys, but I'm not a mind reader. If I was, I'd probably be doing something different. And so, when we think about a person's intention, okay, not the Justin Bieber song, but when we think about a person's intention, how do you prove what someone intended in a given situation? Oh, well. You look at their actions. You listen to their words. You look at the written document. It's Cassandra's rule number 1, right? Write it down. The offeror, the person who is making the offer, must demonstrate by their actions and their words that they intend to create a binding obligation. When we look at that situation to determine if they intended to be bound by the agreement, it is an objective standard. So it isn't if that person actually believed or intended to be bound by the contract. It's if a person who's just a reasonable, prudent, normal person would look at the situation and say, oh yeah, he intended to be bound by that, okay? And so it can also be shown by conduct because, again, I can't read a person's mind, and if they don't tell me with their words what their intention is, I have to look at their conduct. An invitation to contract is not a contract, okay? And then agreeing to make a contract at a future date can create a contract in that you are obligated to show up and talk about that, but it doesn't obligate you to enter into the future contract. Does that make sense? If not, ask me. Moreover, an agreement to negotiate is enforceable. Those you'll see particularly in situations where if you signed a contract where it said, hey, listen, if there's some issue with this contract, or if I have some issue with you, then I am agreeing to negotiate first before I sue you. Totally fair and enforceable. Now, definiteness. I hate defining a word with the word, but here I am. So your book, the law, defines that an offer must be definite. And what does that mean? The terms must be certain, And all of the big important terms have to be defined by the offer. If you fail to omit, or if you fail to include or omit something that is small or is a non-essential term of the contract that doesn't make the contract vague or the offer vague, then your contract isn't void. But if you forget like a really big piece, like, I don't know, the price, the cost, when it has to be done by, all of those things can make your contract voidable. Okay, not void, but voidable. One thing, as I mentioned, when I talked about freedom of contract, courts don't care. They do not want to undo your contract. They want you to stay out of their lives and not bring them breach of contract claims because they want you to contract. Everybody in our economy wants you to contract. And so when it comes to looking at the definiteness of an offer, the agreement itself, courts are loath to destruct or to destroy your contract. Okay, that is not the favored approach. The favored approach is to take out things that might be voidable and to force you to stay in the contract. Understood? Because it is A-OK to do that. Now, let's say you incorporate things by reference in your written document. Totally fine. You can create definiteness of an offer by incorporation of some other document that either provides definition of terms or provides the specific terms related to your agreement. There can be implied terms in a contract, right? Because if you don't include every single little term, like how payment must be received, it could be cash, it could be credit, it could be money order, it could be a check, right? If you don't include that, oh well, that's okay, non-essential term. Because if it had been essential, what would you have done? Included it in the contract, right? So, best efforts clauses do not make your contract indefinite, okay? Because like, what does best effort mean? Nobody knows. Put forth my best effort, and sometimes it's crap, and sometimes it's great. But some days it's just my best effort. So, you have to put some effort in, okay? At the very least, there is some effort required in order to meet a best efforts clause, but you can have them in there. Sometimes there are divisible contracts, right? So there may be contracts within contracts within contracts, kind of like those Russian nesting dolls. And sometimes if you are able to divide out agreements within agreements, let's say one is enforceable and the other one is not, that one that's enforceable is you're still gonna be expected to comply with that. Whereas the court may just, as I mentioned before, excise out that voidable section, and you're going to keep on going. Now, some exceptions to definiteness: requirement contracts and output contracts. Requirement contracts are ones where I enter into an agreement with a vendor, and the agreement is that they will provide me with all that I require. Does that give them a specific amount, a specific number, a specific amount of money that I'm going to pay? No. Does that sound vague? A little bit. But we recognize and want these types of contracts to exist, so we make an exception to the definiteness requirement. So whenever you look at a requirements contract, look for that. Make sure that the terms used in there are good for a requirements contract. Similarly, there are output contracts. So let's say, for example, I want to be the exclusive vendor of some widget, right? I go to the widget maker and I'm like, hey, widget maker wizard, I want to be your sole dealer of your widgets. So I agree to purchase all of your output. Vague? Yes, because I have no idea how many widgets he's going to make a month. He may make 4, he may make 4,000. I don't know. But by entering into an output contract, I agree to purchase all of his output. Totally vague, but again, we recognize it as an exception to the definiteness requirement of an offer because we want people to be able to enter into those types of exclusive contracts. Now, some people might say that, Cassandra, why do we even have to talk about communication of an offer to someone? Like, what? You have to communicate the offer in order to have it be accepted, right? Agreed. Completely agreed. But so often the law makes things complicated. And so an offer, yes, has to be communicated to the person that you want to accept the offer, okay, the offeree. When we talk about unilateral versus bilateral contracts, right? Unilateral contracts calls for an offeree who asks for performance by the offeror without knowledge of the offer. So a great example of this is reward money and knowledge. So let's say you're walking around your neighborhood and you see a lost cat sign and it says $1,000 reward for the lost cat. You start looking for the cat, right? And you find the cat, okay? You take the cat to their owner and they're like, hey, saw your sign, found the cat, give me your money, give you the cat. Okay? Unilateral contract, because an offer was outstanding, the person knew about the offer, accepted the offer in finding the cat, and then demanded payment. Okay, great. Let's say, though, it's your neighbor, and your neighbor doesn't know that the cat's been missing for a while. All they know is that it's your cat, and they don't know about the lost cat signs. They don't know about the reward, and they just find the cat in their basement. And they're like, oh, let's go return Snuffles next door. Take Snuffles next door, and they give back the cat, and the family's really happy, and they're just thrilled. And then the neighbor walks outside and sees the lost cat sign. And they're like, oh, well, I want my reward money. So they go back, and I'm like, hey, I just saw the sign. Give me the money. No. They have to know about that offer before they can collect on it, right? Because the offer was never given nor acknowledged by that person. And so they were not at that time that they performed the offeree. Now, you send out an offer and you're like, hey, listen, offer's open for a week. Okay. Typically, offers are revocable at any time. That's the general rule. For at any time, for any reason. Don't have to justify it. You can just revoke the offer. Take it back. The issue becomes, though, what constitutes revocation? Well, revocation is only effective when you tell the person, hey, the offer is revoked. So, if the offer is accepted before you revoke it, you have a contract, because a contract forms at the time of acceptance. Acceptance doesn't have to be acknowledged, because the party that made the offer already demonstrated an intent to be bound by the contract, right? Because that's the first thing that we talked about when we talked about offers. And then the other person, by making that agreement, there's a meeting of the minds. You're both in agreement, so you have formed a contract. If you don't want to form a contract and you have to revoke your intention, you got to tell the other person, because otherwise your intention is still out there to be bound by that contract. Now, sometimes there are options contracts. Your book goes over what firm offers means. Go ahead and read through those sections. They'll detail that out for you. One thing for you to understand is that revocation is one way for an offer to terminate. Revocation. You pull it back. That's the most common. But then there are all of these other ways, noted on your screen, that an offer can terminate. So let's say I make you an offer, and you're like, meh, I don't love that offer. Hey, here's an offer. My offer is now dead, terminated, because of your counteroffer. Your counteroffer is now the new offer that's on the table. Now, a counteroffer can also be a rejection. But let's say I make you an offer, and you're like, I'm not taking that, I'm not taking anything. Okay, offer is terminated. I can remake the offer if you indicate that you'd be open to it, but otherwise, offer's dead. Offers can terminate due to lapse of time. So if you put a time limit on your offer, time elapsing kills that offer. If the offeror or the offeree dies pending acceptance of the offer dies with them. And an offer that's pending prior to acceptance, if what it's offering becomes illegal, the offer dies once it becomes illegal. Now, what does acceptance look like? Oh, well. Acceptance must be clear and unequivocal. Any change to an offer constitutes a counteroffer, not acceptance. And whether or not an acceptance is valid is again based on an objective standard. And the only person who can accept an offer is the person to whom you conveyed the offer and intended to be bound by the offer. So if somebody made me an offer and I died, my mom doesn't get to accept the offer for me. Let's say I don't even die. Let's say I don't even get the offer, but the offer is for me and my mom just accepts it on my behalf. An agreement has not been reached and I'm not bound by it. The offeror can specify the manner of acceptance, so date, time, how it's accepted, whether it's a phone call, whether it's an email, whether it's a written, signed, notarized document. That can all be effective. If you provide a late acceptance, the offeror can refuse your acceptance because it's late. They can choose to allow it to lapse. Okay, fair point. Now, if you start to perform prior to a formal acceptance, have you accepted? That is the question. If the contract calls for performance, that can, at times, create a unilateral contract. Now, silence as acceptance is not generally acceptance. You have to indicate your intent to be bound. And some good examples of that are unordered goods or unpicked up tickets. So if any of you have, when we are not in the middle of COVID anymore, if any of you have season tickets to a playhouse or the ballet, if you don't pick up your season tickets, you're not required to pay, right? Just the way it works. Okay. So, an offer can be accepted by any reasonable means allowed. One rule that you need to know, because you will absolutely 100% have some questions on it in your quiz, next quiz, will be about the mailbox rule. So the mailbox rule states that, once an acceptance is properly stamped, sealed in an envelope, and placed in a mail receptacle, acceptance has occurred regardless of when it's received. So, if I am entering into a contract with Joe Schmo the Ragman, I write him, "Hey Joe, I'm accepting your offer." I put it addressed to him correctly, put it in an envelope, put a stamp in it, and I drop it in a mailbox. It's on its way to him. But he calls me and says, "Hey, listen, I'm revoking that contract," or "I'm revoking that offer." He doesn't get to do that. My acceptance is already valid. And so one thing for you to take into consideration is, how does that mailbox rule theory apply to email? Well, one thing for you to think about is that email is much faster than regular mail, right? I mean, again, maybe it goes without saying. But email can tell you to the millisecond when something is received, and can tell you to the millisecond when an email is opened, when an email is read. And so I think mailbox rule also applies to email because it's an extrapolation dealing with our advances in technology. We'll talk about that when we meet again. If any of you have ever been involved in an auction or watched Storage Wars, which I do because I love that show, auction sales are fascinating. So when the auctioneer is asking, "Hey, who's going to pay 100, who's going to pay 125, blah, blah, blah," that person is asking for offers. He's not making an offer, he's asking for offers. And so when you say, yep, I'll pay 100 for it, yep, I'll pay 125 for it, your offer is not accepted until the fall of the hammer. So you can revoke your offer. So you're like, "Oh God, why did I say that I'd pay $1,000 for that? I take it back. You look like a not awesome person doing that, but you can do that. So you can withdraw your offer prior to the fall of the hammer. Now, that is the beginning, the first element of us talking about contracts. And so you and I will meet again during our labs, and we will start talking about the other elements of a valid and enforceable contract. If you guys have any questions, let me know. See you next time.